Welcome. Recording is in progress. Okay. Thank you, Zoom. Welcome, one and all. Thanks for coming today. Really appreciate it. I'm going to skip the fake Transylvanian accent, as I'm sure that's considered offensive these days. But what I want to do today is talk about the origins or potential origins of the vampire myth, going beyond what we know about the vampire from the myths and folklore of Eastern Europe, medieval Eastern Europe in particular. And that's why we've chosen this particular term, Egyptian vampires, because a lot of what we associate with nocturnal denizens comes to us from the oldest mythology there is, and that's the mythology of the ancient Near East. So what I want to talk about today is covered loosely on this slide. The Sekhmet myth and the first blood drinker, Shesmu, the Lord of Blood. Basically, for any of you who've seen the YouTube video, I'm not going to go too long on those things because I know they're already out there, but I do want to cover them, and I do want to go into a bit more depth, a director's cut, if you will, of some of the stuff going on within those myths. And in particular, I want to dive into an Egyptian protection spell because it gives us a really interesting insight into the theological and belief frameworks of the ancient Egyptians. It talks about demons and terrors of the night. And then I want to go into kind of some more interesting stuff from the ancient Near East that seems to indicate a belief in the blood drinking, well, absolutely confirms belief in blood drinking demons, but also indicates where some of our modern myths may have come from. And that origin may be a bit earlier than we suspected. I'll also talk about how these ideas have transferred into Eastern Europe. So first and foremost, one thing I didn't mention when I was doing this myth for the YouTube was sources. And this is kind of an important thing because it does feed into some of the later discussion. So the Sekhmet myth, as we know it, originates largely in part of a text we call the Book of the Heavenly Cow. Now, as you can see, this was in the tomb of Seti I, as well as Ramesses II, Ramesses III, and Ramesses IV. So very popular in that New Kingdom period. However, there are other sources for this mythology that I've included there for people who want to go and look up the different versions, because of course, Egyptian religion isn't one official thing with a set of dogma that was decided by a set of priests. It was actually several different nomes or geographical regions, beliefs that all got kind of cooked into what the Greeks then fed us about ancient Egypt and the Egyptians. So we view Egypt, or we did view Egypt, through the lens of the Greeks for a long time, and it can be a hard thing to shift that perception. But if you want to shift that perception, go look at the pyramid texts, for instance, the coffin texts, the Book of the Dead, 57, 145, 179 for this particular one, the Sekhmet litany, so to speak, and also you'll find these texts on magical statues. There are more Sekhmet statues than anything else, probably, from ancient Egypt as well. So plenty of them in the museums. This is also a myth that appears in this text, the so-called calendar of lucky and unlucky days. There are others who I want to call this more of an almanac. You can thank Mog Morgan for that particular one. And I think that's probably a very good way to go about this. So rather than thinking about this as a calendar, the idea of this being kind of an almanac of lucky and unlucky days. There's something behind this myth, an idea called Theodicy, which is about the fall of mankind, but it's also explaining in the ancient Egyptian terms why there is darkness in the world, why there is evil in the world. This concept of Theodicy we see a lot in monotheistic religions moving forward, the Abrahamic religions, the book religions, but it's not something we consider a lot when we're talking about ancient Egypt. This is one of the tales that informs us that Theodicy is actually quite an important concept to the ancient Egyptians. We'll talk about why that is. With regard to the background of Sekhmet, there's a nice little quote I found on a particularly interesting site. She came into Egypt from a place unknown at a time unrecorded. Some of her names refer to this very great antiquity. Lady of the place of the beginning of time, the one who was before the gods were. as a form of the Great Mother, Sekhmet is known as Mother of all the gods. The Egyptians and potentially the Nile Valley people who came before pharaonic civilization would have seen lions in their natural habitat, probably would have admired their strength, feared them for their power, and seen their different habits. Some of those habits are extremely nurturing, as we can see from this cute little picture here. Lionesses are excellent parents. Male lions, not so much. But they also drink blood, which is something to bear in mind. So there's a great observation of the natural world in Egyptian mythology, and it's something just to bear in mind as we move into more mythological modes of thought. So our story starts with Ra, and as the myth goes, Ra is seen to be growing old. He's been on the throne for thousands of years at this point, presumably, and humankind are starting to rebel. They're starting to say that his hair is turning to lapis lazuli, his skin is becoming gold. These are all kind of notions that Ra is becoming ossified in his position and stagnating somewhat. And Ra hears this and sees that humankind are rebelling against divine order, the concept of Ma'at. And he's saddened by this, but he's also angered by this. So he calls together a conclave of the gods and asks for their advice. What shall I do about this rebellion in humankind? And they say to him, send your eye against them, for no eye is more able to smite them. And so this is discussed and considered, and Ra decides to send down Hathor, or Hathor. It's not actually a TH noise, it's House of Horus, so it would be Hathor. Now, Hathor is mostly known as a nurturing goddess, a mother goddess. She's often represented as the divine cow, which is why we're seeing this in the Book of the Sacred Cow. But as with most Egyptian gods, she has multiple sides. One of those sides is a fierce side. So this is how she ends up with epithets like the Lady of Slaughter. She comes down to earth in the form, a new form that we haven't seen before from Hathor, the form of Sekhmet, the lioness. Some say that it was the Uraeus off of Ra's crown that came down to earth in the form of a lion. And so the rebels flee to the desert, and Sekhmet chases them down. She slaughters them all with impunity, and she dances in their blood and drinks deeply of their blood. And the rebellion is quelled, and in some texts it's implied that the guilty have been punished, but Sekhmet's bloodlust cannot be satisfied. She chases people down into the desert. She's eating them up, and she's causing an absolute bloodbath. The land is said to run red with rivers of blood because of Sekhmet's divine punishment. And Ra sees this and regrets his decision. He says, humankind have been punished enough, and we should stop this slaughter, but Sekhmet will not listen because her bloodlust is too strong, and none of the gods are powerful enough to stop her. In some texts, it says that Sekhmet comes back to the heavens and says to Ra, I have overpowered humanity, and it was sweet to my heart. She then plans to go back down tomorrow to do exactly the same thing at dawn. And she does. And the gods see that she's down there slaughtering people and drinking blood, and they realize they can't physically overpower her. In some versions of the myth, it's Ra that comes up with this plan, and in some versions it's Thoth, Jehuti. They think if we can't physically overpower her, then maybe we can outwit her. So Thoth decides to take a concoction. It's either a mineral he uses or it's pomegranate juice. He mixes it with alcohol, turning the alcohol red, and then covers the land with this. red liquid, red ochre. And it's strongly alcoholic. Sekhmet, seeing this, dives into the blood, purportedly transfixed by her reflection at the start, dives into the blood and starts to drink, and drinks deeply. And it being alcoholic, she becomes drunk. And becoming drunk, she becomes sleepy. And becoming sleepy, she becomes forgetful and forgets all about destroying humanity. And she returns to the heavens, and order is once again restored. And so every year thereafter, it was said, they would celebrate the sparing of humanity and honor Sekhmet and Ra by holding the Feast of Sekhmet. And this is where they would partake in beer colored with pomegranate to emulate the blood that was used. What we're going to see as we go through some of the theology behind this stuff and the symbology behind this stuff is that there are strong links between the Egyptian gods and blood, particularly Osiris. Blood and wine are seen as interchangeable things. They're used in ritual as interchangeable things. Wine is seen as the blood of Osiris and some other gods. And we'll dig into that a little bit. Now, there's a variant on the Sekhmet myth that says that she or Ra, alternately, are so unhappy about the destruction that happened in Egypt that they depart Egypt, casting it into eternal night. One does have to wonder if this is a later addition to the myth to explain, perhaps, the eruption of Santorini, potentially where Egypt was cast into darkness for a particularly long time, it seems. So before moving on to Shesmu, I just want to talk a little bit about the idea of what ancient Egyptian demons actually are. And a good place to start with this is the Ancient Egyptian Demonology Project from Swansea under Kasia Spakowska, who I believe has been on your show before. You've had chats with her, right?
Yeah, she did a great talk about ancient Egyptian dreams and nightmares, which is up on our YouTube channel. So that's definitely worth checking out.
Yeah, it's great stuff. I mean, she's much more of an expert on that than I am, but we will touch on some of that today because it interacts with this stuff quite well. So we tend to think about demons in a very kind of post-Christian monotheistic way, that angels are good, demons are bad, demons are from hell, and demons are only malevolent. The ancient Egyptians and the ancient Greeks in particular had this notion of the daemon, which is slightly different. So when you look at it through an Egyptian lens, they have three categories, and those categories are the Anku, which is living people, the Aku, which is the glorious dead, and the Neteru, who are the divine beings, divinity. And demons, or demon-like entities, could be minor gods or composed of those who'd passed on, so the dead. And what could happen sometimes is that greater gods could force them into service to do benevolent or malevolent deeds. An important concept that we will see run throughout all of this stuff is that demons were associated with plague, with disease, with sickness. There was no germ theory, obviously, in the ancient world, and we didn't have germ theory until relatively recently. And it's for that reason we see the idea of sickness coming both on the wind and sickness being brought by demons. And it comes in quite specific circumstances as well, which we'll get into. But there's this idea of the demon on the night terror bringing sickness with it, which ties in quite nicely with the origins of the Eastern European vampire myth, which is very closely associated with disease and plague. So as an example, Hathor has servants, the seven Hathors, or the Hathors, or the serpents, who can act as executioners, soul reapers, and these things are not necessarily evil acts. They are sometimes done to preserve Ma'at, but they would be seen as harmful or things to be afraid of. There's also the concept that where official religion, quote unquote, was something that was part of the state and the state temple. That it's possible that these kind of more liminal deities were part of folk religion. And what we see in Deir el-Medina is a focus on some of these entities, demonic entities, quote unquote, slash minor deities, as something a little bit distinct, even though it's attached to the same theological framework as the official religion of ancient Egypt. Now, Egyptologists in the past have looked at this as a top-down thing. It's not that simple. Cultural exchange happens in every culture that we ever see. So you get the idea that folk religion is doing this upwards and being kind of assimilated into official religion, and official religion is kind of twisting it and putting it back down into culture. So that's how cultural exchange tends to happen. So in the Demonology Project, we've got an emphasis on these beings and the evidence for these beings and where our knowledge of these beings comes from, coming from things like the coffin texts, which of course are ultimately derived from the pyramid texts, from carved ivory tusks, apotropaic magic, the idea of warding off evil. Something that's quite common in apotropaic magic is the idea of warding off evil with something else dangerous, with something else scary, with something else harmful, potentially. If you look over into the Middle East or the ancient Near East, you see certain demons being, like Kazazus, being employed to ward off other demons. So apotropaic magic is things like wands with figures like deities and demons in them on images and things like that. And these were particularly relevant in times like childbirth in domestic settings, because that is when people were vulnerable. We've also got decorated headrests, which speaks to the idea of the vulnerability of the individual during the night and during sleep. And then we have Book of the Dead manuscripts. So those are all the sources that you'll find if you look into the Demonology Project for these things. And you'll see that the this is a riff on some of Mog Morgan's work. He's actually kind of a occultist slash scholar. He comes from an occultist perspective rather than an academic perspective. And I find that kind of stuff interesting because I've been working with these communities for a long time, and I like to explore these perspectives. So he kind of looked into this and looked into the idea of where the Egyptian kind of vampire and demon myths can be seen in the laity, in the common people, so to speak. And we see that some of the names of demons become names of people as you go by, as you go through time. And he also has a slightly different definition for the Aku, pointing out that sometimes Aku could mean undead, transfigured dead, ghosts, and these kind of vampire-like entities. So your loved ones, if they didn't receive the offerings that they're supposed to get, that may come and bite you on the backside, figuratively and literally. So one of these entities is Shesmu. And Shesmu's an interesting character because he starts out in early periods as this fairly negative, scary character called the Lord of Blood and the great slaughterer of the gods. But he works for the gods, particularly for Osiris. He's Osiris's executioner. But he's also the god of the wine press. And that may seem like it doesn't naturally follow. But when you look at the context in which he was the god of the wine press, you'll see that it does follow. So this is the hieroglyph for Shesmu's name. And you can see the hieroglyph for the wine press, just determinative for that, is right there, bang in the center. In description, and I couldn't find a suitable picture of it, unfortunately, so I've had to make one for you. But in description, it said that the Shesmu's wine press was full of human skulls. And the human skulls, or the human heads, would be trampled so that all of the juices and the blood and the ichor would come out. And from that, he would make his wine. So blood wine. Why blood wine? It comes back to this idea that blood and flesh are the sustenance of both the dead and the gods, particularly pharaohs as well, because they are dead gods from the earth. So we see prayers found in different texts asking, beseeching Shesmu to dismember and destroy other deities so that the dead pharaoh may take sustenance from that divine blood. So conceptually, right at the beginning of Egyptian civilization, we're seeing blood as sustenance, one of the key primary ideas of what the vampire is. So coming back to Morgan's work, which I found deeply fascinating to dig into, he says, you know, it's the food of the god and difficult to underestimate the value of food in our relationship with the kind of spiritual entities discussed, all our dealings with the divine realm. So not surprisingly, we discover that when spiritual entities remain unfed or are otherwise neglected, they search for blood and become troublesome. I can send you these references if you need them at a later date, if anyone asks. Now, I should probably just put in very quickly here that as well as, of course, red being associated with blood, being associated with wine, being associated with Osiris, it is also, of course, very strongly associated with Set or Seth or Sutek, and is known to be his color. It's also associated with the desert. It's a powerful color. It's a color that's used in magical operations to often to denote harm or to denote something bad. So I thought I would just bring that up briefly there. Okay. So what else is there about Shesmu? Well, if we're concentrating on his good attributes and the things that he brought to society, he's called a guardian of the righteous, brings sustenance to the just people of the underworld from his pressed blood wine. He protects the innocent from the dangers of the netherworld, and they are many. If we look at the books of the Underworld and the Book of the Gates, the underworld is full of demons that are just ready to consume you. Shesmu is also a fearsome warrior. He's a protector of Ra, and that's like the highest kind of sobriquet you can get for that kind of thing. Travels in the solar bark and, you know, travels the heavens defending against the serpent of darkness, Apep. This is a role that we also see attributed to Set. It's also a role we see attributed to Sekhmet. So powerful deities, dangerous deities are also given this respect as protectors from the ultimate darkness, the ultimate chaos, which is the darkness of annihilation. Now, interestingly, because he has this association with balms and oils and things like that, he's linked also to mummification, to the preservation of beauty, and with Nefertem, who is, you know, a deity associated with scents and perfumes. So he's got a lot of good stuff going for him as well. And as a deity, he grows in power and significance over time. He gets this cult center at the Fayum Oasis, and also at Dendera and at Edfu. These are places known for Hathor and Horus, respectively. And he was sometimes associated with Horus because he was sometimes depicted with the head of a falcon. There's a bit of theological stuff about Shesmu and divine retribution and Horus, and we'll cover a little bit of that stuff shortly. So now we're thinking about comparative mythology a little bit. And this basically, I've got a link for this, this paper at the end of the talk. So Rita Lucarelli, I think that's how you say that, talks about how in Egypt and Mesopotamia, demons are supernatural powers, as we've covered, benevolent and malevolent, and they're acting, you know, on human beings for divine beings. And there are some interesting similarities and differences between what's happening in Egypt and what's happening in Mesopotamia. And it's important to recognize, or remember rather, that Egypt and Mesopotamia are very intertwined culturally and mythologically, and in all kinds of other ways. They were constantly accumulating ideas from each other. I mean, if you look at the very foundation of Egyptian civilization, you see Mesopotamian style serpopads, serpent leopards on the Nama palette, for instance, which is a foundational, you know, text associated with the establishment of pharaonic civilization. So we know that they were trading with Mesopotamia, which would have brought stories, which would have brought ideas, which is why we'll see some crossover. But what I want to do is I want to go into this notion of protective magic and what these night demons were, what they represented, and why they terrified your average Egyptian so much. And we can see a good example of this on this ostraca. Ostraca, pieces of clay that people used to write on, mostly used by the lay people, because paper or parchment, papyrus, was incredibly expensive, not necessarily something that everyone had access to. Clay, on the other hand, was abundant in a lot of places, and discarded clay or broken pots were things that could be used for writing, for practice. We see them using this kind of thing, ostraca, for practice in schools and things like that all the time. And at Deir el-Medina, which is where this is believed to have come from, we have a village of workmen, just to give you a little bit of context. These were all semi-elites in that they were literate, which means they were probably top of the first few percent of the population. The vast majority were not literate. So what we've got here is a non-royal, but still fairly elite set of people who sit somewhere between the real royal elites of Egypt and the masses, so to speak. And so they give us a bit of an insight into what's going on in Egyptian households that isn't completely obscured by decorum. So this is one of John Baines's ideas, is that we can't really get a good picture of what's happening in Egypt from royalty because so much of it is obscured by the decorum that they're all held to. Well, this kind of stuff in particular gives us that insight, potentially. So what this is a spell. It's a protection spell against night terrors. I'm going to read it out to you, and then we're going to break it down a little bit. I'm not going to read it from the hieroglyphs, though, because even on my best day, I wouldn't have been able to read this thing, translate this like this. So, male adversary, female adversary, male ghost or female ghost, be far from me. O dead man, dead woman, without coming forth, I think that's supposed to be, he will not go forth with face forward, with limbs as sound limbs, since his heart is destined for the evening meal. We'll come back to that. The one in the act of striking. We'll come back to that as well. Name, born of name, has extracted your hearts, O dead ones. He has taken your hearts, O dead men and dead women, to the striker. He has offered them for his sustenance of his limbs. As for you, you will not live. Your limbs are his offering cakes. You will not escape from the four noble ladies, from the fortress of Horus. What the bloody hell does that mean? I hear you ask. You're supposed to recite this spell. I really like this detail. I love that this detail is still here. Recite this spell over 4 Urea. That is a clay serpent with flames in their mouths. So you can think of this as like a burner, an incense burner, a candle burner. In the corner of every room or any bedroom in which there is a man or woman sleeping with a man or woman. Incredibly inclusive for 5,000 or 4,000 years old. What this means is that this is a spell which uses the cardinal corners and candles in the cardinal corners, which is exactly like you would find in modern Wiccan practice and pagan practice and various kind of different things along that spectrum, which is fascinating to me, of course, because it means that these traditions, even if they are broken, somehow find their way back into culture. So that to me is really, really interesting. So, but what does it mean? What is this idea? What is this kind of without coming forth, will not go forth with face forward, with limbs as sound limbs? Well, what it seems to mean from context, if we look at other kind of things from the Middle Kingdom, for instance, this is the rite for repelling the angry one. And the demon is stigmatized as one who enters backwards without being seen. This is a concept that the demon that's coming into your room can't come in face forward. The demon that comes into your room has to come in backwards. So it's kind of constrained in some way, that its limbs will be constrained, that its face will be constrained, that it can't look directly at you, or that it's already in a position of fleeing when it tries to enter the room. Okay, so this idea of the corners of the room, the cardinal corners, uses these Urea, and these Urea are really, really important to the symbology behind the protective aspect of this spell, and they tie into the theological idea of what's being fought and who's fighting it, the Prophylactic magic. So these 4 Urea we find in the vignette Book of the Dead 150, and you can see them right up here. And what's going on? Well, it seems like in the 10th hour of night in the Umduat, in which the solar bark is preceded by these goddesses, they are named Destroyer, Glower, Stinger, and Uraeus. So this already ties into the idea of these things have a job in the underworld, and their job also works here in the world of the living. If we look, again, more contextual stuff, I'm just laying out the groundwork here. Look at the Chester Beatty papyrus, and we see some parallels. We see 4 noble ladies whose flames are in their mouths, whose blaze is behind them in order to repel every male enemy, every female enemy, every dead man, every dead woman who is in the body of name, born of name. They shall not come against him by night or by day or at any time. They will not fall upon the 4 noble ladies, these 4 serpents, whose flames are in their mouths and whose blaze is behind them. Well, okay, so how does that work? Well, part of this is about sleep and the vulnerability that the Egyptians felt in darkness and in sleep. If you think about it, think about conceptually what a torch is and what flame is. Flame keeps darkness at bay, but it also keeps the things that rest in that night, that stalk the night, at bay. And that's an extraordinarily primal thing. You're sitting around a campfire, you would see the eyes out in the distance of things looking at you that won't dare come near this campfire. So fire in itself, I think there's a quote from Plato about, fire is kind of a holy thing that keeps back darkness. And conceptually, that would have stayed with them. Well, what happens when you go to sleep at night and the fire is running low? You're vulnerable. You're in darkness. There's no street lighting. Like think about how the pitch black of living by the Nile in a time before electricity or gas or any of those kind of modern conveniences. Going outside of your home at night, you would have to take a torch. It would be scary. Sleeping in your home, you can't necessarily take care of that fire. So it's going to die low. So, and conceptually where this becomes interesting and where this starts to tie in with ideas of succubi and incubi from what we think of as later mythology, but really it's all here right at the beginning. This is a spell, and this is kind of working from the translations, a spell for repelling the dead from sleeping with a man or a woman. And this was a very real fear that the Egyptians had. And this is kind of laid out here. So this is talking about a papyrus in which I believe it's the Isis and Horus are acting in place of mother and child. So there's another magical papyrus that adds a bit of more context to this. Devotes 5 incantations, roughly 1/4 of the preserved text, to the nightly defeat of such spirits with quote unquote vampiric kiss. Theme is equally prominent in the medical texts in which gods, the dead, and demons are said to inflict a stroke upon the patient, arriving as an incubus or succubus and sexually injecting their hostile influence into the body of the victim. The sexual potency of the underworld denizens and consequent threat of demonic rape is established in this coughing text spell 874, where it said, "It's permitted that I return to my living soul when it goes forth on earth and while it is among men, and it will copulate and stride forth. So say the gods." It's already there in their theology that the dead can mate with the living. And so this becomes a very real fear for the everyday Egyptian, that this incubus force, this vampiric force, can come forth from the land of the dead into the home. Now think about what this would mean for certain conditions. Say you suffer from sleep paralysis. Say you suffer from any form of narcolepsy. Say you suffer from night terrors, or say you have an overactive sexual drive, which gives you sexual dreams. All of these things become explanations for these things, but also sources of increased fear. The idea of waking up unable to move and paralyzed and feeling like someone is on top of you is, of course, now explained by sleep paralysis and narcolepsy. I know you had specialists on talking about that when was it? It was fairly recently, Sarah, a few months ago.
Samantha Treasure was talking about sleep paralysis, and also out of body experiences and false awakenings, things like this kind of feed into those sorts of ideas as well.
Yeah. And so, I mean, we know that humans haven't fundamentally changed much in the last few thousand years. So it's fair to say that these people were suffering a lot of the same maladies, and they had a supernatural context in which to understand these and try and fight them. So kind of coming back to the undead for a second, what were the Aku? You could become Aku through a ritual performed by the Aksia, and it's about being an Aku is about having Ika, being effective, having agency essentially as the dead, among the dead. And it would take particular offerings to do this. So we know things like the opening of the mouth ceremony, for instance, the animation of the bar and the car, and these different aspects of the people. Now, during this ritual, and this is where this gets interesting, the Aku were thought to be able to duplicate the knowledge of a living person's heka, their magic, their spells. And so the deceased who've become the Aku exist with this kind of reciprocal relationship of being able to act on the living, but also needing the support of the living. So it's very much a thin veil between the living and the dead in ancient Egypt, which is why ancestor cults exist, which is why you see offerings to immediate family, but not necessarily those things lasting that long. Couple generations usually, it seems, on average. And this is another spell which says, "O you the living who are still upon the earth and who shall pass by this tomb, do you desire that the king shall favor you and you shall be in honor with the great God? Then say 1,000 of bread, etc. For I am cunning, Ika, and an Aku." So this idea of threat, if you do not respect the dead and pay tribute to the dead, they will come back and act in vengeance upon you using their haka, using their magic. So we have this idea here. We go back to the idea of the feast of Sekhmet and blood. Red ochre. Yes, red ochre was used in rituals and put into beer. And this kind of reminds us of the idea that blood and flesh were part of regular offering. They were seen as part of a regular offering and an interaction between the deities, the immortals, the demons, and humanity. Right. Meanwhile, in the Middle East, or the ancient Near East, we've got some other stuff going on, which kind of parallels what's happening here. So we've got this deity Lilith. This is potentially Lilith or Lilith, but it's also potentially Ereshkigal. That there's some uncertainty about that now. But as far back as the epic of Gilgamesh, we see Lilith as the dark maiden, Ki Sikil Lila. She takes on a very similar form to these Aku. There's a very similar kind of fear going on. So there were amulets created to prevent beings like her and her kin and her children molesting the living in their sleep, in particular, at night in particular, during childbirth in particular, and during lovemaking as well. That's an important point, actually, that I semi-skipped before. So Lilith, Dime, there's some crossover between the two, but it's kind of very vampiric ideas, believed to prowl the night in search of victims, to drain of blood, to drain of life force. And eventually we see them focusing in when it comes to domestic settings. So women in labor, children, and potent men are seen to be potential victims of Lilith. Most people will be familiar with the concept of Lilith through the later mythology, which places her as potentially the first bride of Adam, created as an equal to Adam, wouldn't submit to Adam, and therefore was exiled and cursed by God. Roams the land, becomes a demon, hooks up with Satan in some versions of the mythology, becomes the bride of Satan, those kinds of things. Got a rough deal, really rough deal. And then Adam makes Eve from his rib, and it establishes that kind of old school hierarchy, patriarchy that we get, kind of a couple thousand years ago. Very common. Right, so we can see kind of an emerging trend here of the kind of people that will be the quote unquote victims of these demons. And eventually we see Lilith, Dime, and Lamashtu eventually merge into the same thing. I just put this note at the bottom here because I thought it was super interesting, even though there's not a lot more to it. And that's that in a site near Jordan, a load of remains were found and they'd all been decapitated. And the site was dated to around 9,000 years ago, so around 7,000 BC. Why were they decapitating their dead back then? The speculation is that it was a fear of resurrection, a fear of living dead, potentially. Who knows? Could have been anything, really, couldn't it? Could have been a punishment, but interesting idea.
Is that the same sort of area where they found the Jericho skull? Because there are kind of skull cults in that region, and also in Anatolia, in Catalhoyuk, there's a skull cult there, and there's ideas that vultures carried off the skulls of people once they died. Fascinating.
That's interesting stuff. Yeah, I mean, it seems like ritual activity, doesn't it, or something like that? Certainly. Yeah. Lamashtu, I won't go into full detail here, but Lamashtu is Mesopotamian mythology. We see her represented in various monstrous ways as this kind of female demon, very malevolent, kidnapped children while they were breastfeeding, gnaw on their bones, suck their blood, and various other awful, evil things. She was like a lot of the demons that we find in the ancient Near East around this period. She is a composite. And composites were often associated with the other, with the supernatural, of course, but more negative acting and more strictly negative in certain ways in Mesopotamia than you see in Egypt, where composites were the norm, so to speak. All the deities are composites essentially in Egypt, so there's less of this kind of sense that it's unnatural like you get here. But there's some interesting stuff here. She is furious, she is fierce, she is divine, she is dazzling, she's a she-wolf, daughter of Anu. This is a prayer about Lamashtu, or to protect from Lamashtu. Her feet are talons, her hands are unclean, her face like a savage lion. She rose up from a reed thicket, her hair hanging loose, her undergarments cut away. She travels the tracks of cattle, she follows the tracks of sheep. Her hands are stained with flesh and blood. She enters through the window, she slithers in like a snake. She moves in and out of houses. She says, "Bring me your sons so I can suckle them, and let me nurse your daughters." So, common themes. This is a picture from a retro comic book of a character called Lilith, based around this notion. Common themes: sex and death. The idea of sex, the idea that these demons could take on the form of a sexually attractive version, usually women in Mesopotamia, male or female, as we've seen in Egypt more commonly, and exploit the lust of human beings in order to have their way with them, to extract fluids from human beings. And that could be blood, that could be semen, it could be spirit, life force. And these things were kind of all seen as part of the anima in certain ways, that they were interchangeable in a lot of ways. So we see a lot of association with the dead and dead spirits being harmful, the vulnerability around the idea of childbirth, obviously, because, you know, natal death rates were extraordinarily high. Darkness in the nighttime, obviously a common theme. Disease and infection carries through. And yeah, seduction, violation, multiple forms, that kind of thing. More often in the ancient Near East took on a role of seductress, which I think you start seeing the groundwork for a lot of the Abrahamic book ideas and role of women in those times. Okay, so the Strigoi. And so if we cast the net a little bit wider and we look over to Greece now and see what they've got going on. Many might know the Strigoi from the Del Toro TV show. Oh, what was it called again? It'll come back to me. Anyway, the strain. The Strigoi are cursed by Zeus. So they're these two characters that are already violent. They already feed on flesh. They're said to be half bear. I don't know if they're supposed to be symbolic. And they're drinking blood. And Zeus curses them, but they're saved by Polyphonte, their mother, who turns them into owls, or in some accounts, bat-like creatures. You start seeing the template appearing here. So they also become known as Strix or Striges. And in Ovid, we see the Striges, who were said to disembowel infants and feed on blood. He allows for the possibility of the Striges being birds of nature or products of magic, or transformations by witches using magical incantations. And there's a strong association between the witch and the vampire in Eastern Europe. In fact, vampires and witches were kind of interchangeable for a while. They weren't necessarily undead. Anyone could be a vampire. That woman in the village who's sick, she might be a vampire. Or your cousin's sister over there, she's weird and we don't like her and she's not praying right. She might be a vampire. You know, you get this idea of anyone could kind of be a vampire until they started laying down the rules in fiction. So witchdom as a status of othering and vampirism kind of interchangeable. So I find it interesting that that goes back as far as ancient Greece. And then the Romans pick up on this, because the Romans picked up on everything Greek. And we have this physician in the 3rd century AD quoting a 2nd century BC author. And he's saying that from this medical poem, Liber Medicinalis, that he's talking about methods through which to ward off these things. So he calls them Strix. He says garlic works. As far back as, apparently, if we're to believe this writer, the 2nd century BC, this association with garlic fending off these blood-drinking demons and these creatures exists. But you have to decapitate it to really kill it. So again, foundational vampire myth. Decapitation is one of the only ways to kill them. And then the last method, which I thought was really interesting, drive a stake through its heart. So what we previously, and what I'd always previously associated with being the mythology of Eastern Europe, we seem to find the foundations for both in Egypt, in Mesopotamia, and ancient Greece. And of course, that makes sense in the sense that there is a continuity happening here with the way that people trade and the way that mythology moves and culture moves with different people. And these stories grow. A little bit later, we have the Estuaries. And this was more of a Hebrew concern. So it's a female demon, again, shapeshifter, could become a beautiful woman, was a seductress, that she would then drink their blood. This is foundational vampiric stuff. They are very much considered the female vampires of Jewish folklore. And this, well, there's some theory that this derives from French Strix, but it's more likely the Latin Strix, and it's much more likely that it's come from the ancient Greek sources than anything else, which is also a term for a night owl. Again, an association with succubi. They're commonly considered to be part of the incubi, succubi, demon kind of thing. And again, they like to eat babies and eat children and stuff like that. Obviously, a common fear is one's safety, the safety of one's child. So it makes sense that this kind of thing happens. And when you don't have disease theory, when you don't know why a kid would get sick, why they would lose their color and become pale, the idea that a vampire is feeding on them becomes very attractive. And we also see that up into the 20th century in certain villages when people were exploring the Near East and Northern Africa. There was belief in vampires feeding on people, and certain members of the village might be called vampires. There was a case of a woman being called a vampire, and an account from an explorer from around 1930 who was staying in a village, and the name eludes me at the moment. And so we could see this kind of very similar human concerns and fears taking the same manifestations each time, which is interesting. The estuaries needed blood to survive, so that's further establishing this kind of mythology. And in some cases, they would kill pregnant women and babies out of jealousy or spite and seduce, or in some cases, rape men. The estuaries and succubi were both said to be able to appear as human or in spirit form, but could also turn into birds, cats, or various other animals. So again, laying down this foundational shape-shifting mythology that we see both in vampirism and lycanthropy, werewolves, that kind of thing. As an aside, what I thought was an interesting aside, moving over to the Far East, we see the idea of the preta. These are people. These are people who were any of these horrible things in life: corrupted, false, compulsive, deceitful, jealous, greedy. And because of karma and the idea of karma there, they're afflicted, they're punished, and they have an insatiable hunger for a particular thing. They obsess on a particular thing. Sometimes it was blood, sometimes it was stuff that was even worse and gross, like feces, trash. It could be paper, it could be anything like that. And there's a Japanese version called the gaki, which means hungry ghost. And there are various different translations and versions of the hungry ghost in the Far East, and some of them are very similar to what we consider the modern vampire or the ancestor of the modern vampire. So the Japanese in particular had some things that were very, very similar to vampire myths, with kind of their own distinct foundational mythology. And again, these things can shapeshift. They can turn into the doubles of people you might know. So there's this idea of this imposter, this person from your village could secretly be one of these things, could be a demon, could be a vampire, which is probably awfully convenient for the people doing the accusations, I'm guessing. So that's the main meat of it. If you want to kind of go into that a bit more, I would highly recommend some of these texts here, particularly Morgan, if you're interested in the slightly less academic and slightly more esoteric, but actually quite kind of, you know, scholarly done stuff. Then there's the Mog Morgan Supernatural Assault in Ancient Egypt, Seth, Sleep and the Egyptian Vampire. That was an interesting read. Obviously, Robert Rittner, both the mechanics of ancient Egyptian magic and this O'Gardner 363 examination are really interesting reads. And of course, the works of Kasia Spikowska. How could I neglect those? And there's quite a few articles on academia.edu as well that go into Egyptian demonology and what those things were about. So yeah, and I think what we're coming up to 7 o'clock now. So that's me prattling on for an hour. So enough of that. Do you want to open it up and talk about stuff?
That was so brilliant. It was very dense, and I feel like I'm going to watch it again so I can go through it all again, because there's so much stuff in there which is especially interesting to me with regard to sleep paralysis and nightmares, and the kind of altered states that ancient Egyptian people may have experienced, and like you say, put down to their, you know, their sort of theological views of reality and demonic spirits and all this kind of stuff. I wonder if I can just open it up. So let's see.
if you want me to jump back to a slide,
yeah, here we go.
We can do that.
So please feel free to unmute yourself. I've got a few questions here. My notes are quite scruffy as they ordinarily are. So, oh, one thing I wanted to ask is, do you know if any of this is translated into the kind of Tsar rituals that you occasionally get in Egypt these days?
That's really interesting, actually. Yeah, because there's Morgan talks about the Tsar society and how they use dancing rituals and possession in their rites. I'm no expert on the Tsar community, but definitely there seems to be a link, some kind of theological link, certainly, of them inheriting some of the beliefs about the Aku and incorporating them into some of their rites. So I've certainly read some stuff along those lines, yes.
And they're more kind of sub-Saharan traditions as well that have maybe come from those people moving into North Africa, perhaps.
Yep, absolutely. There does seem to be a bit of a melting pot of cultural traditions in Tsarism, or the Tsar tradition. Yeah, but it's something not a lot of people kind of have ever written really an awful lot about in Egyptology, certainly, at least.
I was just reading, there was something you mentioned in your slides earlier that I just quickly looked it up, and I was wondering about if the myth of vampires may have had some root in actual physical conditions of people. And I was reading about porphyria, I think it's called, where people become very pale and their urine becomes dark red, so it made people think that they were drinking blood, and their facial features start to change, and they can even develop fangs if they have acute attacks of porphyria, apparently, which is quite interesting. But I wonder about stuff like that, if there's anything in any of the medical papyri about these kinds of conditions that may have made appearances in ancient Egypt.
That's a really good question, actually, a really good question, because a lot of the medical papyri, they'll give you solutions for conditions without necessarily going into a lot of detail about the conditions. So this is for and this is a book of things to do with the brain, or this is a book of things to do with, so they weren't classifying conditions in the same way that we do in some ways. So it would be, I think in some senses, it might be quite difficult to tease that out. It might be possible if you could find all of the solutions for those symptoms, if you could find those symptoms in the various different medical papyri that we have. What they aren't really is comprehensive at logging conditions in a way that we recognize necessarily very well. They kind of dealt with the different areas quite specifically a lot of the time. But the porphyria thing, yeah, definitely. Like, certainly, if you've got all that mythology coming through, oh, this is the thing I forgot to get to, actually, and this is quite an important point. The Carpathian Mountains, where Transylvania, modern day Romania, but parts of Poland, etc., a lot of Eastern Europe reside around, was once a kingdom called Dacia. And that was a colony, so to speak, or one of the provinces of the Roman Empire. And one theory is that when the Romans kind of emigrated there en masse in some part, they took this mythology with them. So we know that the Romans, from these very accounts, we know that the Romans were talking about this stuff and believed in this stuff. We know that their medical papyri were dealing with this kind of material. So it's entirely possible that what we're seeing is a foundational mythology that has come all the way from the ancient world via Greece and Rome into Eastern Europe via areas like Dacia and the Carpathian Mountains, really taking root there, because that's where that mythology was, bang, dropped straight into the heartland there. And then as that populace has kind of been integrated into the society, and that land has advanced and become its own thing, you'll see its own reactions with its own mythology, its own, we call them quote unquote pagan beliefs, but pre-Christian beliefs, their own folklore, probably absorbing a number of those ideas, including the fundamental things like garlic, beheading, stake through the heart, a stake of hawthorn. it was believed by the Romans, and there were a couple of other woods. But these ideas of these magical things, and they are essentially magical, aren't they, beliefs, getting mixed up with interpretations of things like disease. Porphyria is definitely, and there's another one that makes you sprout hair from the face that's thought to be an origin for, like, yeah, the werewolf one, yeah. And with porphyria, you also have there's the severe form of, so I actually have a mild sun allergy. If I go out in in very strong sun, I will blister, my skin will blister. And if you've got someone with a severe, and then much more severe forms of that exist, of people who will immediately burn and kind of blister up in the sun, and will get weak and very unwell very quickly because they're having an allergic reaction. So if you've got people suffering from those kinds of maladies in a time where there's no understanding of biological science whatsoever, if you've got diseases like porphyria, especially with the receding gums, which give you kind of a fang-like appearance, and if you've also got plagues coming to town where you have no mechanical explanation. So, and that's where the vampire and disease are really linked, because it was thought that in medieval Europe, it was thought that if a plague came to town, later they talked about bad winds, and earlier they talked about bad winds actually, but it seems like in that region specifically, they latched onto the idea of, well, it's something to do with strigoi, it's something to do with vampire. The origin of the vampire, obviously that word comes from that region. So yeah, if you put those things together, you've got the perfect melting pot in that area of all the old religions and beliefs, and then the contemporary takes on what was happening to these people who were kind of becoming, either severely anemic, unable to stand the sun, and needing blood. And there are diseases, things like rabies, for instance. If someone became rabid in a town, they would attack people, and that in itself would kind of help lend credence to vampires. And werewolves weren't seen as distinct things necessarily right at the start. They were kind of classed in the same thing, in the same way that a lot of these demons were classed, like Lamia, for instance. There's another Greek myth of Lamia, who was said to have a serpent tail, but also to be a shape changer who could seduce men and would drink their blood. She was cursed, I think it was by Hera, because she was the queen of Libya, and she was said to be a great beauty, and Zeus falls for her and has an affair with her. And Hera's like, I'm having none of that. She's cursed. And Zeus takes pity on her and gives her some powers, some prophetic powers, to make up for it. And she becomes this cursed being. So the Lamashu that you get from Mesopotamia, the Lamia from Greece, the Strix and the Strigoi, you mix these up with Lilith and stories of her going around drinking blood, seducing men. And then even earlier than that, in ancient Egypt, you have the vampiric kiss of the demon. That's a demon that's coming in, stealing into your home during the night. If you don't take precautions and do these spells to protect you from, they're going to come in and they're going to violate you in some way, or steal your bodily fluids or your life essence. And that concept, I mean, it's funny. The more you look into it, it's like, oh, this is practically an unbroken line. You can see this develop from ancient Near East all the way through to Eastern Europe over the course of 3,500 years.
I was wondering how much this has developed out of, like you were saying, night creatures, nocturnal animals like owls and bats, for example, would actually be pretty terrifying in the middle of the night, and they would likely swoop down low to you as well. I mean, I've been swooped on by a bat and by an owl, and it is quite scary, and that's just a normal sized English owl. So I think that, I think the word Lilith has a screech owl meaning as well.
Yes.
And Strix is also a type of night owl.
That's
so
right, yeah.
The owl does seem to have this connotation of a nocturnal entity. And, when you do see an owl, and also remember, ancient people didn't have like photographs of creatures or were often able to see them very clearly. They might just witness them as a kind of flying blur in the night, or just see that eyes glinting. So I think it's really important, like you were saying, to think about what life would have been like at nighttime for ancient people, when, as you say, there wasn't street lighting and there wasn't light pollution in the same way we have it now, and that things were almost liminal in and of themselves at nighttime.
Yeah, I mean, you wouldn't necessarily see the owls during the day with the amount of places they would have had to hide.
Yeah.
So it is a really interesting idea, and a lot of the descriptions of the Strix, for instance, which you quite rightly note has this kind of association with the owl, and that's right, yeah, Lilu is also a word for screech. So you've got this close association with, and I guess it's kind of this piecemeal thing of, well, we know these things exist in the night, and then, you know, at some point in history we wouldn't have been sure what they were, and so stories would have been told about them, and owls definitely and bats definitely fall under that. And with these Strix, we see some of the earliest depictions and descriptions of them fit an owl, but sometimes they're like an owl that's a bit more like a bat, and it's almost like two people have gone, no, it was definitely like this, it had leathery wings, and no, it had like horns, and it's like, no, it was like tufty big-eyed thing. And yeah, definitely like definitely mixing that up in there good and proper.
Well, I think we also forget just how many animals have been made extinct, and
Yeah,
how populations have dwindled over the years as well. So
yeah,
some of these things may have been a lot more numerous during the average ancient Egyptian evening, I imagine.
Well, in South America, you've still got the myth of the what's it called, the Kuchikubra, this is supposed to be the spined animal that goes and like feeds off of the blood of cattle at night, and is still widely believed in through the populace. And it's, yeah, that, you know, the same as Set. If you think about Set, what does Set represent? What animal is that? Some people say it's potentially this extinct Salawa dog thing that kind of looked hyena-ish, but it had the kind of boxy ears on its head, and it had that quite pointy muzzle. I've only seen one picture of it, which may or may not be real. This is kind of zoocryptology, kind of cryptozoology thing. Yeah, like what was out there really, and how big were some of these bats they were dealing with? Because in South America, we know they get very, very big, and there are bats that drink blood. So
a recent story actually about an owl that was thought to be extinct and has recently been discovered again in African forests, and that's enormous.
Yeah, exactly.
It's almost like a harpy eagle type looking owl, actually.
I mean, that would have been
a harpy eagle would be pretty terrifying to come across in the middle of the night, I would imagine.
Very much.
One thing I wanted to bring up was this idea of suckling and breastfeeding, and it was something I was writing about in my book. Actually, I was researching it, and it was really interesting to me, this idea that personality traits can be passed on through breast milk. So this idea of Lamashtu breastfeeding and suckling babies was an idea that would have been really offensive to ancient people, because, for example, I think in ancient Egypt, sometimes animals would act as nursemaids for creatures that needed it, but they wouldn't use a donkey because they thought that would pass on the stubborn, stupid qualities of a donkey. And even, I think it was something like 18th century France, they banned women that had been charged with crimes from breastfeeding their own children, just in case they passed on any of their nefarious traits. So I think this idea, like you were saying, of bodily fluids having this like spiritual essence of the person that they're coming from, and that spiritual essence can be transmitted to somebody else, is very interesting.
And in 100 years, we'll probably find out it's true.
Yeah, I think it probably is. Let's see what else I've got here. Chantel asked a question, and it was something I wanted to touch upon as well, actually. Kasia mentioned the Urea in her talk, and I did a little anti-nightmare cobra workshop for kids, actually, but I remember that, not seen the reference to the fire in the mouths literally as being a candle or a flame. And that's really fascinating, because when Kasia was explaining to me, it was this idea that the fire was the venom, because venom burns you. If you got bitten by a snake, you'd be burned. And so if these snakes were placed in the four corners of the room, that they could project their burning venom onto any of your attackers, and that would put the kibosh on them, so to speak. So I think that that's really interesting, that they had the flames, and like you say, the light would prevent the darkness from creeping up on you in the middle of the night. And, you know, Kasia was saying that these clay cobras have been found everywhere. They were even like taken on military campaigns with soldiers. So they're found all the way up the Levant. And Chantal asked that could this idea be the beginning of the kind of fire breathing dragon myth, do you think?
That's interesting, because conceptually having the fire in the mouth does tie in with that. And we know that every ancient civilization has a serpent of darkness, has its own dragon. In Egypt, it's Apep. We find similar tales in Greece and in Gilgamesh and all the way up to St. George. So yeah, I do think that there's kind of following in the idea of the tradition of Joseph Campbell. I do think that there is an aspect of monomyth perhaps, or psychological need, just as likely, of an embodiment of this darkness. It's interesting that it takes the form of a serpent very often, and that dragons, serpents and things like that can be found in loads of cultures, like huge numbers of cultures. And having fire breath is a really interesting one, particularly if you think of things like what are they called, Komodo dragons, which have this poisonous breath, this poisonous spit, poisonous mouth.
Gila monsters as well, I think, have poisonous venom.
So that's really interesting. There's the symbology behind the Uraeus and what the deity of Uraeus represents. We only really touched on it in here. The idea of the four noble ladies and their names, the striker mentioned in this spell. We'll go back to this spell briefly. So yeah, there's the Uraeus there. So breaking this down a little bit, I didn't go super deep, and I would recommend the Rittner article on this, because he really goes into every line and gives you all of the background and all of the kind of theology and all of the different papyrus that this relates to, the theology that this relates to. But the idea of the striker, that's a specific name attributed to the Uraeus in, I believe it's one of the chapters of the Book of the Dead, in which the striker destroys the enemies of Ra, destroys the enemies of darkness. So that in itself is one of the names. And then we also see these other names, Destroyer, Glowing, Stinger, and Uraeus. So those are things worth looking up in that Rittner paper, because like you rightly say, the conceptual thing behind those Uraeus, I think is a really good insight into some of the practical applications of what is sometimes seen as a very abstract woo-woo kind of religious magic system. The fact that they've got these things that they're using in domestic settings, in domestic spells, with a really good continuity on them, and widespread belief in the efficacy, and clearly in the, because the way magic in Egypt works is it's connected to the framework. It's connected to the religious framework of how, so you know, if you're using the a Horus sippy, you're pouring water over this depiction of Horus, who's overcoming the poison of the swamps and standing on the holding the cobras and standing on the alligators, and the spell that's being that's recited by Isis on the stele itself. You're pouring water over it, and then you're drinking the effluence, or you're feeding the effluence to the victim. All of that works because it ties into the mythology that surrounds Isis healing Horus. So in those moments, you are becoming the god. So when you're using one of these cobra, it's not just a clay cobra, it is the god. It is Uraeus, and it has the same action on those in that supernatural realm, that they're referring to, because the dangerous supernatural, the response, again, it's apotropaic magic. The response is also the other equivalent supernatural thing. As I mentioned before, Pazazu was used in a similar way against Lamashtu in Mesopotamia.
That brings me to another point, actually, that is there an element of this in the myth of Isis receiving Osiris's seed on his deathbed as a hawk or kite?
Yes, of course, yeah, because she transforms into a kite, and then in some versions of the myth, that's where she conceives of Horus. So it gets really interesting with the Osiris stuff, because going back to Shesmu, Shesmu works on his behalf, and there's some really interesting kind of nods toward this idea of, and we see it in pop culture actually far later in the 90s role-playing games, Vampire the Masquerade. Osiris is considered one of the first vampires along with Set, and they're in this immortal battle with each other, these two vampires. And you can kind of see where that's come from in the imagination, because Osiris, his blood is wine, but wine is also representative of blood. His servants include this bloodletter who makes blood wine, where the forces of Horus and Set clashed after the death of Osiris. The blood that spilled on the earth was said to have erupted with these grapes, and these grapes made wine. But sometimes the wine, you know, if it was from the wrong source, would be poisonous, and sometimes the wine was okay. So sometimes there was these kind of interdictions against wine in some I can't remember the specific instances. So there's a lot of mythology tying, long story short, a lot of mythology tying Osiris in with these ideas quite closely. And I think if you were to look back at a lot of the translations of things like this ostraca, you probably find that where Osiris is substituted in a lot of places, and where Isis can be substituted in a lot of places, you'll probably find that the symbology lines up really well between, for instance, Hathor, Sekhmet, and Isis all become, I wouldn't say interchangeable, but certainly you can substitute one for the other, certainly in later periods where Isis starts to take on the form of Mother of all gods. Then you have Isis in the role of Sekhmet as well as Hathor. And a strong association between the three of them. Similarly, Osiris becomes a composite with various other deities that are associated, like Ra, that are associated with this stuff. So that was long and rambly, but essentially, yeah, definitely strong associations there between
could there be an aspect of Horus being an example of an Aku in a way, if he was conceived in this way, or that children conceived in these succubi, incubi type scenarios would be seen to be possessed of some demonic influence?
I mean, it's really hard to disentangle in early periods Horus the Greater, who's the brother of Osiris and Set, and Her-Shiryu, who's Horus the Younger, and their origins kind of get mixed up a lot. And the symbology that surrounds, I haven't looked at this in a while, to be honest, but the symbology that surrounds the conception of Horus is also interesting, because there are accounts, I believe they're Ptolemaic accounts from the Edfu text, but I can't remember for sure. There are accounts of Horus having another brother, and that brother was conceived at the same time or when Osiris was dead, and that Horus, that baby Horus, was half paralyzed. The reference escapes me, but he was a version of Horus that was seen as an even younger version. Horus and the Horus myth becomes so intrinsically tied in with kingship and appears so established already very early on, that I would be hesitant to say that he has any role as a minor deity in the same sense that you would find, characters like Shesmu. But that being said, because he's associated with Shesmu and they're both servants of Osiris, there's probably an argument to be made that as Horus Shesmu, that is a liminal aspect, semi-demonic aspect of that god, because that's how Shesmu operates. That's the place that Shesmu operates conceptually. But even that, with that being said, as time goes by, obviously Horus becomes this kind of primal entity of primal importance, rather, to divine kingship, to rightful authority, to how the hierarchy works, etc., etc. And Shesmu equally becomes much more legitimized and associated with his positive traits. So he's less about the bloodletting. He's still making the blood wine for the deities in the afterlife and for the pharaoh, because that's part of the natural order at this stage. Doesn't matter that we might think it's weird that he's crushing skulls to make this stuff. It's important to his role that he does that, but he becomes much more legitimized in the sense that he's more closely associated with mummification and smelling nice and preservation, and the kind of immortal preservation of beauty and things like that. So I think what we see really is what we see in most civilizations, which is the legitimizing of these ideas into more official forms that the state uses, and then the folk uses of a kind of like, not always an inversion of that, but they are distilled from that, and they also feed back into that. So we have that kind of two-way cultural transfer of, here's the official religion, here's the folk religion. They're not separate, they're definitely attached, and they work in a cycle, and they're constantly renewing each other. And on this side of the equation, the official stuff, we can only see decorum. We can't see, for instance, this is a really long-winded way of answering your question, but we can't see, for instance, in the official decorum, if Horus can be used in that way, but we can see in the folk magic that Horus might be invoked in a spell of healing, or it might be invoked in a spell of punishment. So there's in his town, in one of his towns, and this is actually a reference in this very spell. For example, hang on, where is the spell? There is a town referred to in this, right, here we go. The fortress of Horus, Imi Senuti. That's a town where Horus presides and punishes the wicked. And so this falls into the mythological framework that being offering cakes, your limbs are his offering cakes. It means that your limbs are going to be fed to this version of Horus that is here to punish you as a magical executor of demons, essentially, a punisher of the wicked. So the idea of the person coming in backwards is like them being bound, and their heart is being removed. Interesting kind of thing with demons and vampires and hearts and stuff like that. Hearts being sustenance for the dead, hearts being one of the things that this Horus, this striker, because the Horus and the Uraeus act as the striker, and they destroy the demon and partake of the limbs. The limbs become offering pieces, cakes. Yeah.
It makes me think actually about the heart, and obviously in ancient Egypt the heart was considered the seat and the soul of the intellect and the personality and the spirit. And also I always think the heart is represented really as a kind of stylized pot that you could almost drink out of. And there's this idea Kasha was mentioning that to feel joy or bliss was to have your ib overflowing, almost though it was a vessel filled with joy. And so there seems to be something symbolic about drinking blood, because the heart is almost represented as this stylized drinking vessel, I think. I should ask another question that's in the chat here. Could you identify a sort of evolution from male-female demons to a more obvious demonization of women over time, and or through cultures as patriarchal structures became more embedded over time?
Yeah, it happens. It happens kind of when you get the earliest versions of, I don't want to name and shame books here, but it becomes most obvious when you get things like, I think the Talmud is one of the early references to Lilith, and it tends to be in that part of the ancient Near East that a lot of these things become codified, that the idea of Lilitu becomes incorporated into the religious structure, that she is a disobedient woman, and to be a disobedient woman is to be exiled and is to be likened to Satan, or a bride of the devil. That comes later, obviously, with the concept of the devil, because that's not in the original older Hebrew texts, but there is still the idea of the enemy. The word escapes me at the moment, it will come back to me. The adversary. So yeah, it seems like, and I'm trying to think if we see that clearly at any point in Egyptian material, and it's only really, we only really start to see a difference in the way that men and women are represented or treated in Egypt with foreign rule, in particular with Ptolemaic rule. So if you look at late period Alexandria, for instance, you'll see some differences until Cleopatra VII comes along, actually, and it's at that point you kind of realize, oh, this had really been slipping into kind of quite an obvious patriarchy through this period. And obviously that's still the case in Egypt historically, in so much as even though there are very powerful female pharaohs, and obviously there's the theory that Queen T may have ruled on her own, that Nefertiti may have ruled on her own. We know Hatshepsut definitely ruled on her own. So we know there were powerful queens, and we know that we theorize that the female line legitimized the male pharaoh. In a lot of cases, that was the tradition. You became pharaoh by marrying the right princess. So that's an interesting way that the woman was legitimizing that. So, and we know that legally women had far more rights in Egypt, and legally divorced, could own property, could do all those kinds of things. So as far as daily living in Egypt, when there was much more of a kind of equal standing in Egypt compared to, say, ancient Greece or other parts of the ancient Near East, where it was a bit less, I wouldn't call it egalitarian by any stretch, but it seems like, yeah, it's the Greeks, particularly when the Greeks come into Egypt, because they had very different views of men and women and their social roles, and also true of the Levantine areas, Mesopotamia in particular, as we've seen, Babylon, Assyria, Persia. All of these areas in their ancient forms had female demons in particular who were seductresses. And that was interesting to me to see how many, when researching this, how many and how much more obvious it was that there was a focus on evil women in those particular areas compared to Egypt, where it was much more balanced.
Mm. It seems to kind of come in, this idea of demonic seductress women as well, with this idea of sex being wicked and evil, and this idea of monogamy and a sort of patriarchal lineage as well in families.
Well, it's control of reproduction, isn't it? So what we see increasingly with the development of society, really, but also kind of, the development of the law in the ancient Near East, and particularly in the Abrahamic religions, is you're seeing an increasing control of reproductive rights, of the way that sin works with respect to the different genders. So certain things, in certain areas and periods, that men can have harems, but a woman cannot do the same thing. Now, there are practical reasons for that. They would have seen that, if a woman has sex with another man and gets pregnant, then she might have a baby that's around forever or has to be killed off or something, and could depose my place, could usurp my rule, in particular if you are a ruler. So yeah, a lot of it comes back to that unfortunate case that only one side has children in that respect.
May I ask something? I'm interested in, I love the cross-cultural stuff. That's really excited me. I'm interested in sort of the ordinary people, if you like, and to what extent did they use these spells? That's the first question. Mm-hmm. The second one, was there a producer of these spells, the way they did, say, in Greece, where you wrote an all-purpose and you just put your name in there and it'll do for you? Is there any evidence for that?
That's a really good question. Thanks for that. Yeah, that's a really good question. So in brief, yes, there is. There was always recourse to, there were two forms, for instance, of diviner. So I'm extrapolating from context here, but this is particularly true in Deir el Medina. So Some would argue that the evidence we have from Dar el-Medina is exceptional because they were semi-elite. Some would also argue that actually this is the only glimpse we have, as I mentioned before, into the daily practices and rituals. As Sarah kind of mentioned, we do find these Urea very commonly throughout the ranks of soldiers and things like that. So these are not necessarily, some soldiers obviously were very elite, but a lot of soldiers were not. So there's a strong indication, particularly with things like letters to the dead, particularly with things like burials of offerings and burials of figures around homes and around villages, that there is a belief, a continuity in belief between what's happening, a form, similar form of what's happening in the temple to what's happening in the home. So when it comes to there being producers of these spells, absolutely. Now, it might be the case that depending on what town you're in, the person that produces those spells is the person who's on rotation from the temple, because obviously the temple priest kind of rotates in and out. They were their own class, absolutely. It wasn't like anybody was going in, and as I'm sure you're very well aware, that wasn't like anyone could go in and be a priest because you had to be literate. So that in its sense meant that the people producing these were one step above the laity, certainly. Were the laity able to read the spells that they were buying? In a lot of cases, probably not. We're extrapolating that idea from the idea that we found burials with what should be books of the dead, and they're administrative papers, but they're bound up like they're books of the dead. So whoever got these things didn't know how to read them, couldn't discern that these were not books of the dead. So there's some evidence to suggest that these spells, that these texts were only being used by, not only being used by the literate, they certainly weren't only being bought by the literate, but they could perhaps only be read by the literate. Now, does that mean that someone else is standing in to read them? Quite possibly. And if you look at Kasha's work, and if you look at Rittner's work, you'll see that they refer to the idea of the house priest, which is also sometimes the wise woman. So there's I can't remember the hieroglyph for it, but there's the recourse to the wise woman became quite commonly known, especially around Dar el-Medina, but it seems like it was a fairly common thing. And the wise woman served a function for folk magic and folk religion and the laity, but the temple priest served for the royals and the elites. And where they would use divination using, say, the tilting statue, for instance, they would approach the god. They had exclusive access to the god because, the temples there were not for the laity. They were not for the populace. They were for the priest. They were for the king. They were houses of the god. So the common people, so to speak, would approach the wise woman, and she would do a different kind of divination. There are some arguments as to what form that divination took. It may have been that they were using amulets. It may have been they were using particular figures of certain deities. It may have been that they were casting bones. We do have contemporaneous evidence for bone casting further south in Africa and in the Sudan. And these are obviously areas they visited and had cultural transmission and population transmission with. So we don't know specifically what form of, say, casting or divination tool they were using, but we know that they were doing it, and we know that the wise woman was doing it. Well, what other functions would the wise woman serve? It seemed that these were very, very important in domestic settings, very important for protection of the family, protection of children, protection during childbirth. We have things like, masks and ivory clappers and things like that that are found in domestic settings, which seem to further imply that this system was known to people. And even if they couldn't read the spells, they were familiar enough with the mythology and with the framework that it all existed in, that they would still believe in it and use it. And the reason that we have some things like this text here that has these empty spaces for name, I think is precisely for what you're asking. It's so that anyone you can take one of these, anyone can copy, potentially anyone with any skill can copy these and then redistribute them out. And you would just either get someone in who could read to read it for you, or you'd learn it and you do it by rote. Mm-hmm. So I hope that helps. I hope that answers.
Yes, fascinating. Absolutely that's exactly how I did. Well, not quite how I'd imagined it, but it doesn't surprise me what you just said. Yeah.
Written's a really good source for that.
I really find this fascinating. I did talk last year on because I come from a very small little village in Sicily, and I got very interested in the idea of the fairy come witch come demon entering the doors and the villages and so on, and cursing you or leaving some gift. And I was going to say, actually, the wise woman, did she also function as a midwife?
Oh, yes, that's right. Sorry, I forgot to mention that. I think that's absolutely one of the important functions of that was around childbirth. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm going to have to go to Rittner and read up.
Yeah, Mechanics of Ancient Egyptian Magic is a really good source for that, and there's definitely mention of it in Spakowska's work as well, actually, with the demon stuff. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome.
And there was one thing I wanted to mention before I forget, actually, is with regards to blood, but blood in a more of a sort of magical sense, and the symbol of the Tiet, the knot of Isis, and some people have said that they think that's menstrual blood, like a piece of blood. It was used as a kind of sanitary towel kind of situation, and that was an ingredient in some magical recipes.
Yeah, I've come across that theory myself as well, actually. Wouldn't surprise me, given that there's so much interesting stuff. When I was researching Profane Egyptologists, or the PhD that became Profane Egyptologists, the book, I spent a lot of time talking to different Kemetic practitioners, and one of the things we don't really think about as Egyptologists who are just studying this stuff in theory is the practicality of doing ritual with kind of interdictions and taboos, right? And there's been a little bit written about taboo. There's a few interesting papers, Wilhelm, a few others that escape me right at the minute, but something I haven't looked at in a while. But one of the things that we realized was that the idea of menstrual taboo wasn't really a thing per se, except in very certain circumstances, but it was absolutely referred to. So for instance, we've got laundry lists and things like that, which mention things, materials used by women. And some of these laundry lists are kind of pointed to as evidence for menstrual taboo, and equally other people come back and go, well, actually there's evidence against menstrual taboo. And I'd have to kind of go back and reread my own research, to be honest, to give you a firm answer on it. But I think that my point is that it was obviously a concern. It was obviously something people thought about, and it absolutely seemed to have a connection to the magical context and to vulnerability. And where we do see any kind of interdiction with menstruation, it's because of the vulnerability of the woman in that sacred setting, who is essentially hemorrhaging life essence into that sacred place. Now, we don't know enough to draw any real conclusions other than that they knew about it and it operated in a magical setting, in that same magical framework, supernatural framework that everything else does. So the idea of the knot of Isis, particularly with everything that Isis represents, with that being associated with menstruation, kind of makes perfect sense in a lot of ways. Like, there absolutely would have been things to address that Egyptologists from even kind of 20, 30 years ago wouldn't necessarily be that interested in, or 100 years ago wouldn't have wanted to talk about. So I think it's a rich area for research. And I think there's a lot of phenomenological stuff to be done with communities who are reconstructing ancient religions for that reason, because they're coming up against rituals and they're going, how do we construct this? Oh, hang on a minute. Is this an interdiction against blood? Interesting. And so we start to learn how the different uses and associations with things like blood take on symbolic significance in positive and sometimes in negative ways. but not in a negative way, in the same way that you find in it's mentioned in one of the anthropological, who is it? Oh, come back to me. Where the women of the village were menstruating. This is further in Middle Africa, I think it was, where the women had to leave the village and go and stay in a separate place because the blood taboo, so to speak, of the village.
Like the idea of impurity.
Exactly.
And that in some Jewish sects as well, that the women have to go and spend a period of time in isolation. Yeah,
that's it. But what there's been quite a lot of argument about this, where it's been approached, which is not a lot, but where it is, it's like no one seems to agree on it. But it was recognized, but it was not necessarily something that was quote unquote taboo, because taboo is supposed to exist in all times and all places, but this seems very circumstantial. And it's like, in this particular nome, in this particular time, then a menstruating woman should not enter this space. All other times, no reference to it, doesn't seem to be a factor, doesn't seem to be something thought of as unclean or anything like that.
I mean, it's interesting really, because just thinking about the times in a person's life when there would be an excess of blood is pretty much the province of women, because it's menstruation and giving birth. Other than dying on the battlefield because of a terrible wound, generally speaking, there wouldn't be many other instances where there would be a lot of naturally occurring blood. So it does seem to be like a female domain. Yeah,
absolutely. And that makes me wonder, if maybe in the ancient Near East, that's why we had that association with the blood drinking seductresses. And they didn't start as seductresses, they started out as like these harpy style awful monster things that roamed the land to kill your babies and drink your blood. And
hopefully not a premenstrual tension type of situation.
Well, like
mythologized.
Seems a bit extreme, doesn't it?
Let's see what other questions we've got here. Steve asked, you mentioned decorative pillows. Does this mean the Egyptians gave special protection to their heads?
In theory and practice, because the decorative headrests would have protective beings on them to protect them from nightmares. Again, this is something that's more in Kasha's sphere than mine, but the idea of the dream world and where you go when you dream ties into the idea of the spirit and, well, the body doubles, so the bar and the car. So it could be, if you and again, this is really much more Kasha's thing than mine, but you would need protection when going into dream, because you are theoretically going to another place. You're not just in your head. So you're taking that with you, so to speak, by association.
Did they know brains were for things?
Not really. They thought brains were
skull-offal. Someone told me that the translation for brains is skull-offal.
That's what I thought, but they seem to be taking special care of their heads.
I think it's because
I wonder if that's more because they're like the location of your eyes or something. Because there was an idea you were going to get decapitated in the afterlife, and there was a comparison between going to sleep and dreaming every night and dying.
Because it's your senses and your mouth. Your mouth does the magic to speak. That's how you speak Heka, is through the words. So I think the brain was, it was basically poured out of the skull because it liquefies after death, and they wouldn't pull it out with a fork. It turns out with experiments, it's like it doesn't work. You can't do that. You can't pull a brain out with a fork. What you do is you whisk it. So they would put the thing in, whisk the brain, and help liquefy it, and then it would just be poured out, and the head filled with resin if it's a good burial, and the brain was just whatever.
But they did live behind their eyes, so to speak. Thank you.
Kasha's definitely the one for that, though. Thanks for coming, Stevie.
See if we've got any other.
Oh God, I'm trying to find that anthropology link you were talking about. I'm staring at all my anthropology books.
I've got the reference somewhere in my book, and I will go back and look at it. I will. I'll find it.
There's one more question in the chat. Was there as much fear or description of male demons having sex with victims versus female demons? Seem to almost always have that as an aspect, or could they be wrong about that?
Yeah, so this spell is chosen because it's particularly good at being fairly typical, in so much as that we see lots of the theory behind the spell represented in lots of the other texts, and this spell seems to treat dead men and dead women as equally dangerous, equally capable of violation. And I think if we're thinking about in practical terms, sleep paralysis and how that affects people, and the incubi succubi experience that has inspired magic like this, then it becomes pretty clear that this does affect, you know, both well, halves is the wrong word nowadays, but both male and female in the ancient world would have experienced this, and they made allowance for that, in so much as a lot of it seems to deal with both. They're equally dangerous, they're equally feared, they're equally respected. Yeah, it's kind of later, there's later bastardizations of this that that associate demonic forces, you know, increasingly with women, especially in over in the ancient Near East. So
there was one other thing as well that I was reminded of when you were talking about Lamashtu merging into Lilith, is this idea as well that they were kind of coming after small children. But there's an idea with Lamashtu, I think, where a boy child is seen as protected once he's circumcised. Do you have the same kind of formula in Egyptian beliefs as well? Because I know they practiced circumcision, but was there a spiritual, a demonic protection element to circumcision?
That's a really good question, and I've got to be honest, it's something I haven't thought about in a very, very long time. I'm going to have to come back to you on that one. I'm just thinking about the spells of the rites of initiation and things like that always tie into the protection of the gods.
In the images that I've seen of circumcision in the ancient Egyptian sense, people look older, whereas in Mesopotamia it seems that they got circumcised regularly as quite small babies. I think it was something like after 11 days. I can't remember. There's a day. It's a day period anyway. So
which tracks, because it's very young. It continues to be very young.
Carries on in the Jewish tradition as well. But in Egypt, it seems to have occurred to sort of pubescent boys.
Transition to manhood. Yeah. Again, I haven't looked at that material in a long time, but it was basically when you got your side lopped off at the same time, didn't you? And they tended to be quite a lot older then. I think you're looking at like closer to 10 than not. I can't remember. There is symbology that surrounds that initiation period and that transition from child to adult. And there are definitely gods who deal with that quite specifically as well. A lot of them are household gods like Bess. But yeah, sorry, I'll have to get back to you on that, because I cannot remember the reading I've done on that. It was years ago.
No problem. I think I've exhausted my questions. Does anyone else have any other questions? You've answered all of my questions brilliantly, Paul. Thank you so much. It was just such a totally fascinating session. I could easily go on all night.
My pleasure. My absolute pleasure. Yeah. Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. Anyone else have any other last questions for Paul before he goes? Steve, got a question? Or are you waving goodbye? He's waving goodbye.
He's good.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. And thanks everyone for coming along. And I've recorded this, so I'll put it up on the YouTube channel and let everyone know when it's up there. So thank you very much. It was brilliant.
Thank you. I see Hi C saying goodbye. Thanks, Hi C. Thanks all for coming.
Bye.
Really appreciate it.
See you soon.
Bye.